सो 7 बज के आप शुरू कर लें तो फिर साढ़े वास्ते डिस्कशन की ज़्यादा समा हो जाएगा, ठीक है। मैं एक दो ये भी गल्लां करनियां भी जो विचार सांझे किए जाते हैं ये सिर्फ एक सीमित विचार आ। दिस इज़ जस्ट अ लिमिटेड scratching of the surface, and in no way am I claiming that I can provide you with answers to these complex questions. Maybe nobody can ever provide a complete answer. And really, my appeal is for you to go and research this for yourself and to discover for yourself what these ideas represent. And in some senses, I think that's the tragedy of the Sikhs, is that we want ready-made kind of packaged solutions. And that's why we don't really take it seriously, because we don't really own it for ourselves. So that's my appeal, is not to come here simply to take something, but to do something with this, okay? And feedback and help each other to learn. That's the aim. Goshti bhi yahi hundi gyan goshti. That's the Sikh methodology. Koi daave nahi aapa karte. But I'm always ਮੈਨੂੰ ਜਦੋਂ ਕੋਈ ਵੀ ਸੇਵਾ ਮਿਲਦੀ ਆ ਤਾਂ ਇਹ ਸੇਵਾ ਆ, and in fact it's a blessing because it makes you want to go and research and think about these questions. And ਆਪਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸਾਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ we should all do this, we should all take it in turns to present, and we can build the picture up. So ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ topic ਹੈਗਾ, we decided this idea of Jamna Marna, yeah, life and death. And again, this is a hugely complex issue. And there are philosophers in the highest, kind of most prestigious universities writing books on this, and they've been debating it for thousands of years. And I think we will debate for another 1,000 years. I think at the kind of basic level, this question is there a life after death? And I think in some senses, you can look at this from a philosophical perspective. You can come at it from a scientific kind of logic perspective. Or you can come at it from a very personal perspective. And if you look at psychology, some theories on psychology, they say that because we are designed in such a way as human beings that we can think in the abstract, which means we can think of the past and the present and the future. We have a sense of our own kind of lives. Therefore, inevitably, we're going to have a sense of our future. And some psychologists say that the prospect that when you physically die, that's the end, is a very bleak kind of vision of life. It's like saying you've spent 50, 60, 70 years trying to achieve so much, and then at the end of it, it's kind of, you're in the dustbin. It feels, at a subjective level, it feels like it can't be just that. And in fact, some psychologists have said that if there wasn't some prospect of an afterlife, then towards the end of your life, you would get so depressed, because in a sense, all you can look forward to is the end. And therefore, this is about hope as well, maybe. It's about our own kind of psychology. There is another very interesting, it's called it's the gambit, it's the gambler's justification for life after death, which is based on this premise that even if there isn't life after death, it's still worth believing that there is. And that's based on this idea that just in case there was life after death and there is a heaven or there is a God that's going to reward you, if you kind of dismiss that, then if it happens, then you're in trouble. You're going to end up in hell, yeah? So you might as well have a slight belief in the possibility of that happening, just in case there is, yeah? Because you don't have nothing to lose. If there isn't, then you haven't. So that's the kind of, a good gambler would gamble on life after death. That's the kind of point there. But let's just kind of, I was thinking about, genuinely, this is the first time I thought about this, this statement, life after death. And it seems like an oxymoron. An oxymoron is where you've got two kind of phrases in one statement that seem to cancel each other out, yeah? And so they don't make any logical sense. And in that sense, you know, life after death, if there is death, then how can there be life? And it might be more appropriate to talk about life after life. Does that make sense? And that's why often people talk about afterlife experience or the afterlife rather than life after death. It's kind of like almost illogical, because if something's dead, then it's dead, you know. Unless there's some, I mean, I suppose one of the ways in which there would, in Christianity, is this idea of the resurrection. That Christ dies on the cross, yes? And then he rises. So that's the idea. But we don't really kind of follow that form of thinking. But it raises a question, if there is something after death, if there's another life after your physical death, and your body kind of withers, what is that place? You know, how can we envisage that place, that state of existence beyond our physical body, yeah? In very simple terms, where do we go? Where do we end up? And even the way we pose that question itself is hugely problematic, because where do we go? It's like a common sense that we get on the bus somewhere, we get on a train, and we go to some place, yeah? And often we talk, oh, you go to paradise, or you go to some, I don't know, Sachkhand or any other description, implying that it's a journey. But that would imply that that place is somewhere else on the earth, which kind of doesn't suggest that it's not some other existence. So even this notion of going from to where, and you know, and that the way we often conceptualize that is that we are inside our physical body, and somehow the body, some kind of soul or some essence of yourself leaves the body. And you see it on these movies and in images, don't you? See it in Bollywood movies, particularly, where somebody's died and then the kind of light comes out of them and it connects, or there's a light that, you know, we often see this thing about some kind of light. And you know, one view is that your soul kind of transmigrates, it leaves the physical body and then enters somebody else, some other physical form, yeah, a species or whatever. Or it goes to heaven, but then we often think about heaven on the clouds. You know, if it's physically traveling, then where does it kind of come to that place? It doesn't make any kind of logical sense because that is itself a physical phenomena, isn't it? If you think about it, something that physically travels, that's a material object that travels. And if we're saying the soul isn't a material object, then why does it have to go anywhere? Does that make sense? If it's a material object, why does it have to travel? And traveling itself is about the physical realms that we're in. Are there different parts of the body that stay behind and other parts that go somewhere else? And here, obviously, I'm kind of pointing to this question of the soul. And, you know, often it's depicted that the soul resides within in your heart. Don't we say the heart and soul, or your heart? And there are some people saying that there's something about the heart. And you can see why people historically believe that there was some force inside the heart, because this is one organism that can actually still live on outside of your body. It can still beat, yeah? And you know, people who are kind of medical doctors will know that cardiac tissue, it beats because it has its own nervous system, independent of the brain, yeah? And that's how people can start a heart, and chemically you can start a heart. So in the ancient world, people felt that there must be some force in the heart, that even outside of the body it's still beating. And therefore that made some logical sense that it must be the soul or something. I mean, today we would say that that's just a certain chemical reaction and it's a cardiac tissue and it's doing that. But nonetheless, there's this idea that there is another part of your physical body which is not physical. But that begs the question, if it's not physical, how is it attached to your physical body? Is it attached to your brain? Because people talk about the God center, you know, the hypothalamus. These are lots of different ways in which researchers are researching spiritual experience. Is it in every cell of your body? And that's an interesting question in itself. You know, if there is a non-physical part of our bodies, where in the body does it exist? Now, if it's in every cell in your body, then actually every cell, every so often dies. You know, our skins, we shed those cells. And therefore, does a bit of your soul go with every cell in your body? Or is it connected to your brain, which is often when we say somebody's died, you know, in kind of medical, when the brain stem stops to function, that's the point of death. But if it goes somewhere else, where is that somewhere else? Yeah, what is that place where it goes? And these are you know, questions that you can approach from different perspectives, from a theological perspective, from a scientific perspective as well. Now, if we just think about death itself, death of matter, death of the body, in purely physical terms, in terms of scientific terms, actually nothing dies, you know. Our bodies don't die. The cells, the chemicals don't die. And this is the law of conservation of mass. You will be familiar with that. And there's two ways in which you can think about that. One is in terms of the way in which objects will change form. So, for example, you know, ice can, 100 grams of ice can change into 100 grams of liquid water. So, in some sense, the ice has died, but the elements that make up the ice, the water, it's just turned into water, yeah? So that's one way, is that nothing dies, it just changes in form. Yeah, it changes form. The other way is a bit more kind of in terms of, you know, the way in which chemicals are constituted, and you know, others will know more than me, the kind of the way in which there's a relationship between energy and matter. But in essence, when a body is burnt, it doesn't die. Just like, you know, if you burn a piece of wood, it gets turned into ashes and smoke, and you've still got the same matter there. Similarly, when the body is cremated, it turns into ashes and smoke. It's still there somewhere, okay? Yeah. So the point there is, what is it that dies? Because the body doesn't die. It just gets turned into something else. And you could say it's kind of been recycled. And some people are suggesting that maybe this notion of the transmigration is a recycling of everything. And that kind of, I think, is more consistent with the Sikh worldview. Let's just explore a bit further. I suppose this also brings up another question as to what is the body made up of? Is the body simply a physical entity? Or is it something else? So I've got an image of the Terminator there. You know the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's a robot, isn't it? But that's got such a sophisticated kind of a computer in there, and we talk about artificial intelligence today, that he appears to just be like any other human being. But we wouldn't say that the Terminator has a soul, would we? We would say the machine hasn't got a soul, yeah? But we would possibly say that human beings have a soul. The problem then is, what is it a part of the human body? So is it independent of the body? Or is it a product of the body engineering? In which case, why shouldn't then a robot, if it's engineered, develop a soul, yeah? So there's this question about what is the human body made up of? And again, if you look at kind of, go back to ancient Greek times, there were all kinds of crazy ideas about the ether, that the spiritual realm is ether, and even the way we depict the souls and things like that, you will find slightly ghostly kind of, and sometimes you find these auras, you know, that people have this aura around them, and people talk about out-of-body experiences. So again, these are kind of, you know, it's not as simple to answer that question of life. Is not simple because there's so many other assumptions that you have to make. So just in terms of what are the main arguments for the idea that there is life after death, or life after life, if you like. First of them is that it seems to be quite a popular idea across cultures, across the globe, but also across history. It seems to me that this idea that you don't just die when your physical body goes, and you can find it in text, You can find it in lots of philosophies as well. It seems to be quite something that doesn't go away. So if it's an idea that's so prevalent, then one might suggest there's some truth in it, yeah? And another way is, and there's lots of, some researchers looking at this, neuroscientists, is that people who have had near-death experiences can recount experiences that they've had of, and they talk about light, and so they will describe these experiences of these transcendent experiences of feeling at peace or whatever. And some of that is captured within text. Some of it's captured within novels and narratives and stories. And the third one is this idea of reincarnation. And certainly within the Indic system there, and Buddhism and Hinduism particularly, is this idea that our souls enter other bodies. And that therefore our soul itself must have come from another body. That could be other persons or it could be non-persons, okay? And I suppose the research there would be how people can talk about previous experiences, yeah? That they will recount that they had some relative, or there's some research, people say, well, I've been to this place in a previous incarnation, and they've described it quite accurately, okay? So these are some of the kind of main arguments, the kind of ways in which people, scientifically if you like, try to justify that there must be an afterlife. Some of the arguments against this is that actually there's no scientific evidence of any afterlife. There's no absolute proof. Certainly there are lots of stories, lots of claims, but when you actually begin to apply scientific rules, there's very little evidence, if at all. And you might argue that, you would find some evidence if there was any kind of suggestion there. Now, some people challenge that, and they challenge that the science only measures certain things, it can't measure other things. And therefore, then you would say, well, science shouldn't even be thinking about this question because it's out of the realms of science. Neuroscience, there's lots of interesting research. I mentioned this earlier on, where they do study the brain activity. And now, because we've got these ECGs, you can actually monitor what's going on in the brain. And there's some suggestion that spiritual experiences can be, measured within the brain. Now, the question there is then, does that mean that that's a soul that's operating within the brain, or does it mean that it's certain endorphins, chemical reactions that create these experiences of bliss? Yeah. So when somebody's sat doing Simran, really kind of for a long period, and they feel this bliss, is it that they're activating some spiritual awakening, enlightenment, or is it the fact that they're just creating the conditions within their brain that allows them to have these kind of endorphins? And there are these and certainly you can measure people's blood, and you can find endorphins. It's like they are like drugs, but they are like serotonin and other things as well. And neuroscience is interested in that. And another argument against is that different religious traditions would depict life after death in completely different ways. So within the kind of say Islamic tradition, and I'm sure that this is a very simplistic representation, that they have this notion of paradise as being lots of nature, a kind of green, and that's why, by the way, Muslims have green. That's why green is the kind of color of Islam, and they have all these mosaics on their mosques, because they think that is a depiction of heaven. Yeah. And they also, another thing, particularly in Mughal architecture, you'll find lots of symmetry. Yeah, if you look at Mughal, like the Taj Mahal, it's perfectly symmetrical. And part of that idea is that within the Islamic tradition, there's this idea that symmetry itself represents divinity. Yeah? Something about symmetry. And in fact, we have it here as well. Some of these influences here around the way in which we depict that. But the problem there is that in different cultures, they won't even depict heaven like that. If you think about the Christian the way in which, all these paintings within the St. Peter's Church and things like that, how they depict gods and heaven and hell are very culturally specific. So within a lot of Christian iconography, Christ is seen as, residing in heaven, and he's a white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy. Now, does God, I mean, in a sense, do you have, so some people would argue that these depictions of heaven are simply our own depictions of our lives here that we then replicate in heaven. I've heard of some groups within Sikhs saying, yeah, in heaven, in Sachkhand, our Jatha is doing Kirtan there. Or everybody's dressed like us, yeah? Now, I'm not saying that's not true, but it seems that that might be more about their own desires about the afterlife, yeah? The difference between what you might desire, and everybody did, I mean, and the one often is the one of, there's loads of, I don't know, you don't feel pain, yeah? This idea that in heaven you don't feel pain. But in some senses, and again, if there are any medical people here, actually pain is essential to survival, isn't it? Feeling pain, if you stop feeling pain, you lose a sense, yeah? So what does it mean? What does pain mean there as well? And we think about floating. Well, do you want to float for the rest of eternity? I mean, that might be seen as a thought, it might be hell. Is that hell? Or whiteness, you know, a place of whiteness. So I think the Muslims have probably got the best so far. And they're saying it's full of wine, rivers of wine and virgins and greenery. It's like a camp, you know. And I did ask the Muslim, I said, why do you have this? He said, well, it's a way for people to think about the reward. I said, well, is that the reward you're looking for? Mm-hmm. You give up on alcohol in this life in order for them to be drunk forever. It just makes no sense. Anyway, I'm sure that they would refute my simplistic representation of Behist. This is called Behist, by the way. Now, interestingly, if we look at Gurbani, it deploys a lot of these terms. And that's the confusion. You think that if the Guru's mentioned Naraka, Swarga, Behist, then we must believe in it as well. But I'll ask you a question. If you use certain words that you take from this tradition, does that mean you believe in them? Sometimes we have to deploy the kind of concepts around us because that's the language that people understand. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily believe in those words. And that's the mistake we make. If we just take it, but we don't know what context the Guru is talking about this. And that's where we'll be going. So we know about in the kind of Abrahamic faith that there's this idea of heaven and hell, and also God and Satan, Shaitan. We Gurbani be Shaitan loves on that. But again, it doesn't mean that we believe in Satan, you know. And there's a whole kind of description of Satan and who that is within the Abrahamic traditions. Heaven and hell, reward and punishment, and those kind of things. One of the problems is, in very simplistic terms, they said, oh, if you be good in this life, then you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell, yeah? The sinners go to hell, and the good. But ideas about sin themselves change over time. You know, is Boris Johnson a sinner? Is he going to end up in hell? He certainly doesn't believe he's a sinner. He believes that he did it the best he could under the COVID, yeah? So who determines who's a sinner and who isn't, yeah? And that's a really complex question if you think about it, because I'm sure you have people who you think are terrible people, but they think that they're perfect people, yeah? And so, again, and this day of judgment and all that kind of stuff. Okay, just moving on. I've got to move on. So what does Gurbani say about heaven and hell? Narak Swarg. Just got a couple here. Ithe ek shabd hai Guru Granth Sahib chon aapa sab kuch liya. Jithe rakhe bekunt. Ithe bekunt is often another way in which they talk about within Indic tradition, heaven or Sachkhand bekunt bhi hai. Jithe rakhe bekunt tithai tu sabna te prithpal jio. Wherever the protector of all keeps me, there is heaven. So in there, Gurbani is saying, Jithe tenu Rab ne sharan deti hai. Wherever you've gone into the kind of protection of, ote bekunt ban gaya. There's no sense that that has to be only after death. There, I think, invoking the idea of what is a heavenly space for us now, yeah? So in that sense, you can make heaven in your own home. And we can make Sachkhand within the Gurdwara, within our own minds. Again, Maharaj kende ne, Kautak Kod Tamashiya Chitana Avas now, Nanak Kodi Nark Barabaro, Ujjara Soi Thao. So Nanak, that place is desolate, like dreadful dark hell, where people are engrossed in worldly pleasures and forget the divine. So again, this is using these ideas about heaven or hell as metaphors for the kind of way we live our life. So you might argue here what Guru Nanak's saying, if you go into some brothel or some place where the people are drinking alcohol, gambling, and all that kind of stuff, immoral, that is Narak. And if you can be out of that space, then you are in Swarg, yeah? As opposed to this being something that happens when you die. Okay. इत्थे महाराज कहते पूर्ण ब्रह्म रव्या मन तन में आना दृष्टि आवे नरक रोग नहीं हैवत जन संग नानक जिस लड़ लावे. When one is completely focused on the divine in thought and action, then one does not see anything other than the divine. Nanak, one who is in love with the divine, is not affected by the malady of hell. So again here, Guru Sahib is saying, je thodi surti ਉਸ ਪਰਮਾਤਮਾ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਉਹ ਦਵਾਈ ਗੁਣਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜ ਗਈ ਆ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਨਰਕ 'ਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਜਾਂਦੇ, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਵਰਗ 'ਚ ਆ ਗਏ. By definition, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਵਰਗ 'ਚ ਆ. As opposed to this being something that happens after you die. ਮੇਰੀ ਮੇਰੀ ਧਾਰ ਬੰਧਨ ਬੰਦਿਆ ਨਰਕ ਸੁਰਗ ਅਵਤਾਰ ਮਾਇਆ ਤੰਦਿਆ. It's again due to excessive greed to possess meri meri tal. And more one is shackled by worldly temptations, it is the corrupting influence of the worldly temptations which causes one pain, a hell, a narak, or pleasure, a heaven, or a swarg. Again, it's saying that narak or swarg is about how you live your life, how your conscience, how your own personal morality is. That's narak swarg. And probably this is the most clearest kind of critique of these traditional ways in which, particularly within the Islamic study, it says, Kavan narak, kya surg bichara, santan do rade, hum kahu ki kaan na kadte apne gud prasade. What is the concern of the discourse of heaven and hell, both of which are rubbished by the seekers of true God realization? By the blessings of enlightenment from the Guru, I have no concern with either. Now this is a very interesting line here. I think what Gurbani is saying is, why bother yourself with this? Even worrying about what happens afterwards, you should be worried about what happens now. I have no time for this, he said. Minnu enade ਲਈ ਕੋਈ ਹੈ time ਨਹੀਂ. And so in that sense, they're not saying that ਇਹ ਚੀਜ਼ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ. What they're saying is, ਇਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸੋਚੋ ਹੀ ਨਾ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਵਰਗ ਹੁਣ ਬਣਾਵੋ. ਜਬ ਇੱਕ ਹੈ ਹਰ ਅਗਮ ਪਾਰ ਤਬ ਨਰਕ ਸੁਰਗ ਕੋ ਕੌਣ ਅਵਤਾਰ. When the only entity in the eternity of existence was the omnipresent creator, ਜਦੋਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਰੱਬ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜ ਗਏ, were the occupants of heaven and hell then? It said, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਪਰਮਾਤਮਾ ਨਾਲ ਜੁੜ ਗਏ ਆ, ਬਸ ਹੋਰ ਕੋਈ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ. ਨਰਕ ਸਵਰਗ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਲਈ ਕੋਈ ਉਹ ਜਗ੍ਹਾ ਹੀ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੀ. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਜੁੜ ਗਏ ਆ, ਬਸ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਟਕ ਗਏ ਆ. You've achieved your ultimate. I was thinking about Baba Janel Singh. You know, he was famed for one saying, ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਜ਼ਮੀਰ ਦੀ ਮੌਤ, ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਸਰੀਰ ਦੀ ਮੌਤ ਮੌਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈਗੀ, ਜ਼ਮੀਰ ਦੀ ਮੌਤ ਮੌਤ ਆ. He's saying that, you know, the body dying is not a true death. The true death is when your conscience dies. Death of conscience, yeah? And that is perfectly consistent with what Gurbani is saying. ਆਪਾਂ ਦਿਮਾਗ ਨੂੰ ਆਪਣੀ ਸੁਰਤੀ ਨੂੰ ਨਹੀਂ ਮਰਨ ਦੇਣਾ. ਜੇ ਉਹ ਮਰ ਗਈ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਮਰ ਕੇ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਸਰੀਰ ਸਾਡਾ ਹੈਗਾ. In fact, in that is like death before life. Yeah, your body is still there, but you're dead. And Gurbani talks about that quite a lot. ਅਸੀਂ ਮੁਰਦੇ ਸਰੀਰ ਹਾਂ ਫਿਰ. We are living dead. We're like zombies. So when Gurbani does evoke heaven and hell, Narak Swarg, it doesn't do it to tell people about these places, but to actually critique this idea. Surg baas na baanchiye, dariye na narak nivas, ho na ho so hoi hai, mane na kije aas. Kabir Sahib kende, I have no desire whatsoever to go to reside in heaven, and I fear no whatsoever of being sent to reside in hell. Kenda minu Narak Swarg ਲਈ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਕੋਈ ਹੈ ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ, ਆਸਾਂ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਨਹੀਂ. I will not abide by your narrative of come what may, because I have no desire to go to your heaven. Now you've got to remember Kabir Sahib. He was in Banaras. He was from a mixed Muslim background, but he was brought up with Hindu priests, yeah. But he was never really accepted, and unne Banaras bahar karta sika panta ne. And that's why Kabir Sahib har ke sant na kiya Banaras ke thag. Kabir really has a problem with these religious people, and that's why he said, I don't want your heaven, I don't want your hell. And he said it quite clear. And he said, you use heaven and hell to frighten people, drawn vaste, in order then you can extract money from them, because you are the ones that you are the ones who can release them from this. And if you look at, say, what happened in Europe from Martin Luther and the Reformation, it was the same thing. You had the priests who were saying, if you want to go to heaven, then you have to come and give us alms, you have to give us money. And so you had all these corrupt, very rich people, very powerful people, going to the priests, giving them money. And that's how all these big churches were built, because the kings were giving them money, so the priests would then give them a place in heaven. And okay, I'm going to move on, because I'm going to have a discussion. I think the logic to see, maybe this was the shabd that you had in mind earlier on. Gurbani de vich Ramkali Mahla Pehla kehne pavne main pavan samaya, jyoti main jyot ral jaya, mati mati hoye ek, rovan har ki kavan tek, kaun muare brahm gyani mil karo bichara, eh to chalt pya rahao. Hanji. So basically the Guru Arjan Dev Ji कहते भी पवने मैं पवन समाया, ज्योति मिल ज्योत रल जाया. It's all part of a cycle. It's all part of nature. It's all part of that, and it's part of a cycle. So there's no death there. It's life. It's life after life after life. So kaun muare is saying, who's dead then? Koi marta hi nahi hega. So it shabd bahut lamba hega. We can study. You can certainly look that shabd. Agli kich खबर ना पाई रोबन हार भी उठ सदाई परम मोको बंदे बंद सुपन पिया पखलाए अंध यो तो रचन रचाया करतार आवत जावत हुक्म पार न को मुआ ना मरने जोग न बिनसे अविनाशी होग जो ए जानो सो एहो नाहे जानन हारे को बल जाओ कौ नानक गुर परम चुकाया. इत्थे सारा परम चुकाता भी ये जगह हैगियां नहीं हैगियां, ये ना कोई मरे ना आवे जाया, ना कोई मरता ना जांदा. सो असी इहदे दा साडा कोई चक्कर ही है नहीं. सो बिल्कुल. So each of ਆਪਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਨਰਕ ਸਵਰਗ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਮੇਰੀ ਕੰਕਲੂਜਨ ਆ, it's a state of consciousness of mind. ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਕਵਨ ਸੋ ਮੁਕਤ ਕਵਨ ਸੋ ਨਰਕਾ, ਹੁਕਮੇ ਮੁਕਤੀ ਹੁਕਮੇ ਨਰਕਾ. ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹੁਕਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਆ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਮੁਕਤੀ ਹੋ ਗਈ, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹੁਕਮ ਚੋਂ ਬਾਹਰ ਨਿਕਲ ਗਏ ਤਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਨਰਕ 'ਚ ਚਲ ਗਏ. ਸੋ ਇੱਥੇ ਹੁਕਮ ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਜਿੱਦਾਂ ਆਪਾਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ, बेणी कहे बैणी भगत बैणी का शब्द है, कहते बैणी कहे सुनो रे भगतो मरण मुक्त किन पाई. कहते डिवोटीज नोबडी हैज एवर अटेन्ड लिबरेशन आफ्टर डेथ. क्योंकि कई बार ना कहते हुण मर गया हुण इहनूं सच्ची अक्सर सिक्खी दे विच जीवन मुक्त सो आखी है, मर जीवे मरिया. So this is interesting. It's saying that you die, the only way you can achieve mukti, which might be heavenly kind of consciousness, is if you die whilst you're still alive. Yeah, Jivan Mukt, those who die and remain dead yet still alive are said to be Jivan Mukt, liberated while alive. So in that sense, in Sikhi, if you want to go to heaven, you better do it while you're still alive. Yeah, because it's a state of consciousness, that's what it is. Bani de vich we get shabd maro, phir jeevo sadhi. ਤਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਮਰਨਾ ਹੋਈ. It says if you can become imbued with the shabd, and ਆਪਾਂ ਗੁਰੂ ਨੂੰ ਸ਼ਬਦ ਸਮਝਦੇ ਸ਼ਬਦ ਗੁਰੂ, then you will never have to die again. सो इत्थे 84 लाख की भी साढ़े कोई लेना देना है नहीं, ये 84 लाख चना ये तुम शब्द के नाल जुड़ गए, थोड़ा 84 भी कटिया गया. So just to kind of conclude, and then we'll have a discussion, time ज़्यादा हो गया. Physicality is formed through natural elements, yeah, infused with air. And Gurbani talks about panch tattva, ये शरीर है कि ना पंजा तत्ता दा. Upon death, breath merges with air, the light empowering our sight with light, and the mud through which we are formed to mud. And you can find lots of shabds in Gurbani about that. मिट्टी मुसलमान की पेड़े पे कमियार कर भांडे टाके कई शब्द है. So death is the total absence of an element. Now this is interesting. जिदा आप शुरू किया सी ना about the conservation of matter. So in that sense there is no death ever in the physical realm. There's no death because all matter is recycled and turned into something else. So real death is the total absence of an element. However, physical death does not concur with this abstract definition, as it is a transformation of our physicality, and that never dies. So in this sense, no one truly dies, for death would be the unquestionable eradication of both the tangible and intangible aspects of an individual. The truth is that in some senses, even when our bodies go, we still remain. And as you call on social media, if you've got Facebook, you'll probably live forever. You've probably got immortality. And who knows where technology might take us. But our memories of each other live with us, don't they? So in that sense, we, you know, our fingerprint, our presence never goes away. Physicality, we just get recycled. So what transpires then, the followers of conventional religious point to their texts yet, there's nothing evidential to uphold those claims, and that's true. There's no evidence that there is this heaven above the clouds or anywhere else. So they are just kind of their own myths, if you like, but more wittingly that they are myths that are spun to control and to justify all kinds of genocide as well. Because often what you'll find is this notion of jihad is where you can justifiably kill the kafir, yeah? If we find what happened with the Holocaust with the Jews, and you find God is always in the Crusades, you find what's happening with Hindutva in India. And I'm sure Sikhs have used that same justification to kill people because they're manmokya. And this is how then this idea is often deployed as a genocidal, because all the gurmukhs will end up in heaven. All the people who in my group will end up in heaven because we're all good, even though we might be committing sins. And all the people who are there will not, yeah? And that's a corruption. And this is the corruption that the Guru saw. This is what Kabir Sahib saw. So coming and going in this sense of physicality, being born and departing are factual, but coming and going in the sense of actual existence and then ceasing to exist beyond the human body are impossible. So it's our conscience that really matters. And we can only know our conscience whilst we know ourselves. So let's just focus on whilst we know ourselves. When we don't know ourselves, we can't control that. And you know, as you say, if you weren't able to control your conscience or develop some kind of spiritual elevation whilst you're alive, then how can you do that when you're dead? How can you end up in some heavenly place when you're dead? It makes no sense. But that's how a lot of religion functions. You pay your money and you'll get a ticket to heaven. Okay, that's it. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. So I've probably made lots of errors, and I haven't got into 84 lakh journey and all that, you know, cycle of birth and death and, you know, species, because that's a whole subject in itself, and Gurbani has lots of comments about that. So questions or the Lord thing, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੀ ਜੇ ਕੁਝ comment ਕਰਨੀ ਹੈ ਆ ਜਾਓ.
comment ਤਾਂ ਕਰ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਆ. थोड़ा जिहा समराइज हो जाएगा. पहला आप लाइफ डेथ